Good morning, everyone. I'm Leanne Griffin, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled, Seeing Through the Smoke, Current Understanding of Marijuana Use, Science, Effects, and Intervention Strategies. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, I am the host, by using the Q&A panel. You may also communicate with us through the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. So you may use the Q&A panel to send any questions you have as you think of them. The presenter will answer questions at certain times throughout today's presentation. Our audio is being broadcast through the internet to your computer. You must have speakers attached to your computer and have the correct software and the volume on. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and I've posted these options in the chat panel as well. If you continue to experience a loss of audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio portion of the presentation and view it on screen to qualify for the statement of credit. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 5 business days. Also, a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to participants also within that same time frame. As many of you know, FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits, earned attendance, we have launched a new website that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for every webinar and workshop taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. So at the conclusion of today's webinar, as usual, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FADA website. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. Once you do register and complete the evaluation, you'll be able to access a statement of credit inside your member profile. Do keep in mind that any information you provide FADA as part of registering remains confidential. Also, as usual, completing the evaluation is necessary in order to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. And please do note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Friday, June 22. Approximately 1 to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, please be sure to include your Florida license number for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Do note also that WebEx monitors arrival and departure of attendees and provides us with a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar, and we are not permitted to provide partial credit. So let's go ahead and learn a little bit about our presenter today. Joseph Hyde has more than 35 years of clinical and supervisory experience in community-based substance abuse and mental health services, including prevention, early intervention, treatment, and recovery support services. He was the founder of the New England School for Prevention Studies and currently plans, leads, and delivers training and technical assistance programs for single-state substance abuse authorities, behavioral health, and primary care providers adopting clinically preventative and intervention strategies addressing substance use disorders and behavioral health risks. And we were expecting to have Dr. Wynn Turner also present with us today. I do not believe he's going to be joining us. And if he does join us a bit later, we will attempt to connect him as expected. So at this time, I'm very pleased to introduce Joseph Hyde. And Joe, if you're ready, I'm going to go ahead and turn control of the presentation over to you in just a moment.
Okay, I'm ready. Great. Well, good morning, everybody. This is Joe Hyde. Yeah, Wynn said he's going to try and join us. I was on the phone with him late last evening. He got grounded in Alabama because of weather problems, and that was going to attempt to join us from the American Airlines, what do they call that, lounge area where it's quiet there. So we'll see what happens. I want to thank you all. I want to thank FATA, and I also want to thank the state of Florida for inviting us to provide this presentation. I think that there is a lot of very new information out there that is highly relevant to both prevention folk as well as intervention folk, and that has been largely our focus for the last decade as we've been working on these topics. So I want to walk through a couple of things by way of sort of grounding and orienting folks. First off, I want to talk about the course objectives, and that there are four, and there's a fifth that I would sort of add to that, that we want to bring to folks as best of an understanding as possible regarding cannabis and cannabis use from a public health perspective. So that's first. Second is we recognize that cannabis use and other substance risks and protective factors. We want to talk about the motivators for cannabis use. We want to talk about the development and use of a tool that folks in Vermont have developed called the Cannabis Intervention Screener. And we would like to orient folks to a new paradigm for helpful interactions around cannabis use. So those are the principal ones. I want to do a specific sort of shout out to our prevention folk about some of the content here, and much of the content here actually, and that how I think it is directly relevant to your work, and that I'm speaking from a framework of CSAP's 6 prevention strategies, and that I think 3 of the 6 strategies are you'll be able to hear and find here directly relevant information. The first is information and information dissemination, which I'm going to circle back to on the next slide a bit, because information right now is a very hot topic. The second is in the business of prevention education, where we have these conversations with young people and adults regarding a particular topic area. And one, I think it's important that we think that people are armed with appropriate and accurate information, and as well that we have these conversations not as didactic lectures, because generally that just doesn't work as well, that these are more sort of reflective conversations where then the content that we are providing can be better anchored in people's thoughts and understandings and the meaning that it may have for them. And then the third part of it is for those youth or adults that we may have some concern about, how do you initiate sort of a problem identification and referral process? So 3 of the 6 prevention strategies are addressed in the content that we'll be covering here. 2 other things that or one other thing in particular I want to mention is that one of the things that I think goes far beyond the scope of this presentation is to litigate or relitigate the changing culture related to cannabis. That you know, many states have legalized medicinal cannabis. Other states have now gone with full recreational and cannabis and medicinal cannabis. And if you followed the news from earlier this morning, the Parliament of Canada just voted and approved of full legalization at a national level, a first time, I think, other than one South American country. So I'm sure that will be a huge buzz, no pun intended, over the next few days in the media. So, I mean, there are lots of things going on in our culture, and it's important for us to be armed with the best information that we can have. Okay, let's see if I can get this up. There we go. One of the things that I would really encourage everybody to be mindful of is that, to put it bluntly, written materials regarding cannabis, including some scientific studies, are just all over the map. And that their studies are often contradictory. And that these are things that I cut and pasted from newspapers from 1 week about 3 weeks ago. And that it just talks about all sorts of things. And sometimes when we dig into it, the rigor of the science isn't quite what we would hope it would be. And so I would encourage everybody, when they're reading something, to use their critical thinking skills. And skepticism isn't a bad thing right now, because it is just all over the place. And some of it, is coming out of seemingly, or not seemingly, esteemed research institutions. Probably the biggest one that I've seen in recent times has to do with, 2012 research talked about, the neurocognitive, or particularly the cognitive functioning impairment associated with, regular or heavy use of cannabis, and that less than a month ago, Journal of the American Medical Association published then a subsequent study that says the vast majority of cognitive deficits resolve in 72 hours, completely discrediting work that had been published several years before. So again, the science is changing dramatically, and we need to be knowledgeable and cautious about what we jump to. So with that as a preface, I'm going to start out. One of the things we know, as I mentioned, any number of states have legalized cannabis, and even more have legalized for medicinal purposes. And, there have been worries about how these changes in the laws would affect adolescents and young adults from a public health perspective. Thus far, what's come out of Colorado as sort of ground zero has not shown dramatic changes in youth use. Actually, the Colorado use in the last several years has been declining with the youthful population, which surprised a lot of people. I mean, there's always been a higher than average use of all sorts of things in Colorado, but there has been a steady decline. Part of the thought of that, truthfully, is that Colorado has a really good prevention program that the state supports and is run on the community level, and that probably has more to do with it than the changing and the changes in the legislation in terms of recreational use. There's a joke that has been circulating around by a number of scholars that I've talked to who said it might also be that kids aren't smoking weed because your parents are doing it now and it's just not cool anymore, so who knows. But it is interesting to watch, and the truth is we don't know what the long-term impacts are, but from what we've seen over the last 5 years, it hasn't had the dramatic uptick as as was worried when this first began. What is true is that we need, because of the broad availability and the high levels of use, we need to be more strategic and tactical in what we're doing in terms of prevention, early intervention, and treatment. Because it doesn't fit in some of the what had been some of the earlier kinds of approaches that we've had. So, prevention efforts. Prevention science just regards risk and protective factors as a central piece of work and a central focus. And we're going to talk in some depth about that. One of the things that I would remind viewers about is that risk and protective factors don't speak to risk and protective factors regarding initiation of use. They principally talk to risks for misuse or the development of a substance use disorder. So that broader sort of community efforts and the like probably have better impact in terms of delaying initiation of use. But it's important to really understand what these risk and protective factors are. I will go into a fair amount of detail regarding those from a youth perspective and a family perspective, and talk more, I think, about protective factors specific to youth, because I think those are really important, and protective factors oftentimes play a more potent role in terms of delaying onset of use. So, we need to develop, more effective strategies, and hopefully this content will support your efforts, and that, it goes beyond this conversation to talk about formal treatment. We have one slide at the very end that talks about what's the best evidence for it. But one of the things we also do know is that there are any number of strategies that can be used to get young folks and adults to stop using and interventions that are short of a treatment engagement. Just a little bit of interesting fact that you may not be aware of. In terms of myself, my first involvement with the SBIRT initiatives goes back to 1998, because the hospitals on the East Coast, where I was the training director in Rhode Island at the time, were part of the sites for the original studies. What many folks don't know, in terms of when SAMHSA picked it up, there was a very active competition, so to speak, between the Center of Substance Abuse Prevention and the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment regarding who would lead the SBIRT initiative for SAMHSA. And that it ended up being CSAT, as I think many folks know, but it was a very active conversation in there. And if we look at some of the work that's going on right now in terms of NIDA clinical trials, particularly up at Dartmouth, they are principally describing their work with adolescents and this screening and brief intervention within, you know, the medical world as primarily preventative in nature. That so it lives in a gray area, but it also speaks to the fact that that there are many things outside of the office of treatment that can have really potent effect in terms of delaying and discontinuing a person's involvement. You know, the question is, can we be effective in terms of activating behavior change? So I think that that's an important thing that should drive our thinking as we're moving forward. Okay, got a quiz for you. You don't have to answer these on the chat or the Q&A if you want, but this is more just to help you with your own sort of baseline around this. I will answer every one of these as we are going through this, as we're going through the day. So the first question is, what are the 2 primary active compounds in marijuana? And then you pause and think about that for a second. You might even want to jot them down because we will cover this in a little bit and we'll see what your knowledge base is. The second, I'm going to change this question up a little bit. Truthfully, I'd forgotten to take out a word when we've done this presentation or presentation similar to this a few months back. So it is, the question to you is, how many states have today legalized recreational cannabis? Third is, what % of users vaporize, do vaping as it's referred to, versus just smoking cannabis? In terms of popular culture, the person who sells legal through dispensaries cannabis, what are those people referred to? The fifth question, which is an important question that is worth noting for further conversations, what is the average potency of THC? Just gave away 50% of the first question. And what was it 10 years ago? And finally, what are some of the reasons why it's been hard for folks to stop using, even when they want to? So those are the 6 questions. I ask you to ponder on those, jot down your answers, because we will cover those throughout the course of this conversation. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about the history, because it's a pretty interesting history. In terms of recorded history, you know, going back 5,000 years BC, so nearly, you know, 7,000 years now, you know, from recorded information that's been, you know, culled, that cannabis was viewed as both as a medicinal, spiritual, and recreational substance. Originally growing up in the plains of Central Asia and then sort of spreading around the world. In the 30s to the mid-90s, that most Americans viewed cannabis use as dangerous and harmful. There's some interesting history about where that shift came from, but that's probably, if we have time, we might chat about that. And that in the 1970s, for a very brief period of time, based upon a federal suit brought by what was then a former Harvard professor, cannabis was legal for, I think it was less than a year, but it was fully legal in the United States. And then legislation was pushed through Congress and made illegal again, and that was the first time that it was categorized as a Schedule I narcotic or Schedule I drug. So that was an interesting snippet of history. In 1996 was the first medical cannabis programs, and as of a Gallup poll recently, you know, 84% of Americans believe cannabis has some form of medicinal value. 2012 marked the first recreational marijuana, and today versus then, 60% again of adults think marijuana use is okay. That certainly has been, I think, concerning for preventionists in terms of the whole perception of risk phenomenon that is, although not with sterling evidence, but with some evidence, is predictive of future behavior. And I think the piece that for both Wynn and I, where some of our concerns is that our society yet doesn't clearly understand what are the implications in this shift, and we really don't understand the science of new marijuana. There is a lot that's being learned, and I think, truthfully, from a prevention and a clinical perspective, the fact that we don't know so many things is reasonable, if you will, strategy from our part as caring, compassionate professionals to say caution makes sense. Because there are a lot of things we just don't know. Okay, so the culture of cannabis. There is a culture shift taking place, and it's based on changing opinions, increasing information, but as I mentioned, that there is limited long-term and unbiased scientific understanding. I think that, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on, that for quite a long time, the type of research and the freedom for research in the United States has been pretty difficult, really since the 70s, and scheduling cannabis as a Schedule I. And so that I'll circle back to that in a bit. But, we are only just beginning to understand the short and long-term benefits and consequences of the new and more potent cannabis. I think one of the things that is important to know, and sort of circling back to one of those questions, 10 years, 20 years ago, the average potency of cannabis in the community was at about 6%. The average potency, according to the DEA today, is 17 to 18%, with some strains into the mid and high 20s. And if people are using some of the extracts that we'll talk about, you could have potencies to 60, 70, maybe even 80% pure THC. So that is part of where the concern is, that there is newer and more potent marijuana available. We're also just beginning to understand the differences in types of marijuana. And that the second major substance in cannabis is CBD, otherwise, known, its full name is cannabidiol. And the ratios of CBD to THC are important things to be mindful of, because basically one of the things that CBD does in terms of the intoxicating effect of cannabis is that it neutralizes it. CBD is also the place where there's the greatest science, or there's pretty strong science, related to its medicinal values. That's if you've followed any of the literature around Charlotte's Web, Charlotte's Web is one of the first cannabis strains that functionally has no THC in it, and that's been very widely disseminated in terms of the treatment of certain conditions, and it has no psychoactive effect. So so that there are the different types of cannabis is important, the ratio is important, how much people are using, the methods of use, and the fact that there are highly, highly differential responses based on the individual. I interviewed a manager of one of the medical cannabis dispensaries a while ago as part of another piece of work that we're doing. And one of the interesting things that this woman shared with me was how highly differential are the responses to edibles, which we'll talk more about. And she said, for one patient, you know, a 5 milligrams would put the person to sleep. For another patient, really depending upon their digestive system, it could be 10 times that much and still have no effect. And so he said that it is a highly individualized response. And I think that that's important to know too when we are forming our messaging related to this. So in summary of this first section, you know, cannabis originated in Central Asia. It was first described, you know, about 5000 BC. For most of, you know, recorded human history, cannabis was viewed as medicinal, spiritual, and recreational. Early on, cultures recognized that there may be some benefits of cannabis use, but they also noted, even back then, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, there were risks connected to use, and I think that that's an important distinction. We also view cannabis as it co-evolves with our society, you know, and that cannabis use has our attitudes have been changing, as have our policies. It was first recognized in Western medicine in the 1860s, where it changed. And in the U.S., the laws on cannabis and public attitudes towards its use are evolving. Current trends, you know, are moving in the direction of legalization specifically for medicinal use and increasingly for recreational purposes as well. So that's a quick summary. One of the things that I'm going to do throughout this is that about every 10 slides or so, I will do a summary, because one of the things, having done a lot of PowerPoints, I don't want death by PowerPoint, so to speak. And that at several spots along the way, and this will be the first one, I'll do a summary of the sort of the key objectives in this, and I will extend to you then an opportunity that if you have any questions about this content thus far, could you put it in the Q&A? And I will do my best to then take a quick pause and respond to that content that's there already. I'm going to check the Q&A right now.
And Joe, we do have one question.
Okay.
All right, so we goes like this. We have clients that are prescribed by medical physicians to use cannabis as a medicine. The clients are mentally ill and have a diagnosis. Would that have an impact on their mental illness? Medical doctors or clinics are giving prescriptions for such.
It's probably a conversation that would take a while, to be honest, and that there is some evidence that if you have patients who have psychotic disorders, that the use of particularly high-potency THC-type cannabis can exacerbate psychotic symptoms. That in terms of other disorders like trauma, depression, there is some but not super strong evidence that may have some positive effect. There is also some but not real strong evidence about some potential benefit for anxiety disorders, but there's also risk connected to anxiety disorders because of cannabis can have, which I'll describe a little bit later, what's called a biphasic effect, that in a small amount you'll get one effect. If you use a bit more, you will get the exact opposite effect. What I would really encourage is that, you know, your medical provider, you know, and your treatment team perhaps have a conversation both with the patient and, you know, again, we're happy to talk sort of offline about this, because this is a deep dive conversation. And some medical folk have no issue with it, except for your patients with psychotic disorders. So that's kind of a quick thumbnail, but again, this is a long conversation. Other questions?
Yes. We're actually getting some good questions. The next one may be a little similar, not quite the same. Have you heard any evidence about benefits or studies of THC on dementia treatment?
There are not THC, cannabidiol, that there are actual NIH studies going on right now looking at the use of the cannabidiol, that other part of the cannabis plant that's non-psychoactive, because it is known to be neuroprotective. So there are active studies going on at NIH looking at it in terms of its preventative and interventional capacity for dementia.
All right, and it looks like the last one we have for right now is, do you think that it's important to add some type of mental health services to providers that distribute cannabis?
That's an interesting topic. Again, I think we're happy to have a conversation related to that sort of at another time. It is a very interesting topic. That's actually a topic that's going on in the industry right now as well. Not so much in terms of mental health services, but more around sort of wellness kinds of services, where mental health and positive behavioral health may be a dimension to that. But that's a much longer conversation. But it's a good question. It's a very good question.
You know, and that's interesting too. I believe we have a webinar coming up that's going to touch base on that a little bit, if memory serves. But anyway, that's all the questions we have at the moment.
Good.
So, Joe, if you would like to carry on, we're good. And I think at around 11 we're going to stop for our break. So we can carry on if you like.
Perfect. Thank you much. Good questions. Thank you, folks. Keep them coming. Okay. So let's talk about the science of cannabis. You know, there are places now that are doing gene mapping or genomic mapping, and that it's actually being done by some of the bigger industries, scientific industries right now. I've had the pleasure to, the medical school at University of Vermont does a whole course for physicians and anybody else who wants to take it on cannabis, and I also attended the Harvard Symposium on it, and as well the one that NIH did a couple of years ago. And so it was interesting to learn more and more about the science. One of the things that they learned is that there are 91 different strains of cannabis, and that doesn't include the sort of, it's not cloning that's the word, but the sort of the mixing of sort of strains that's also going on. Each one of them has a different expression of its THC, its CBD, and the terpenes and other cannabinoids. And I'll talk about in a bit what terpenes and cannabinoids are. And that when people talk about how one strain has a different personal experience from another, they're probably right. That because these things are sort of, it's sort of like, you know, how many different flowers are they? Their smells are different, they look different. So that's, I think it's an interesting piece to understand. THC is primarily associated with the intoxicating effect of cannabis. That's what people use to get high. And it's also one of the principal elements for pain relief. An important thing to be mindful of, and a term that you may hear, and if you're unfamiliar with it, is called the biphasic effect. And the biphasic effect is that cannabis, and there's other medications and there are other substances that have this, but cannabis is really significant for it, is that at one dose, at a lower dose, THC will be experienced one way, and at a higher dose, it will have the opposite effect. We primarily see that in terms of anxiety, that at low dose THC basically people will chill out, to use more slang terms. At higher dose, but somebody might have a panic attack. And it's that biphasic effect as a negative experience that oftentimes is what becomes a powerful deterrent. I'm never going to do that again. So that THC, the second principal substance in cannabis is CBD, the cannabidiol that I already mentioned. And it's non-psychoactive. It is anti-inflammatory, and so that it has some value in terms of pain and arthritis, and there are some topical expressions that you can find in some of the better sort of equipped medical cannabis places. We did a film shoot for nurses and medical professionals in Colorado a couple of years ago. Really teaching nurses and doctors how to have these kinds of conversations with their patients. And as part of that, then we got to tour some of their sites there, and it was really quite interesting that, that there are these cannabidiol productions that people are not smoking. They're using it as salves for arthritis. So it's interesting. Neuroprotective, I alluded to some of the research that's currently going on related to Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. It neutralizes, it mediates the effect of THC, and there's a possibility, there's not strong evidence, there's a possibility that it may have some anti-carcinogenic factors to it. One of the things that's happened with the changes in breeding over time, largely driven by California originally, is that the more high the potency of THC in cannabis, the lower the potency of CBD. And they did that because people were looking for bigger, better, and stronger intoxications. And connected with that, the stronger the THC, the higher the risk of having a biphasic reaction. So I think it's important to understand sort of how this works so that we can be knowledgeable in our conversations. And then terpenes are these other things that exist within the plant. They also exist in other plants as well, but they do contribute to the overall effect. If you have a knowledgeable person, they may talk with you about the cannabis entourage effect. And that has to do with the interplay between THC, CBD, and these terpenes. And there's also there are other cannabinoids that they don't exactly even know what they do. But from the genomic studies, that there are something like 483 different chemical constituents in natural cannabis plants, with 80 known cannabinoids. And that makes it a really sort of interesting plant to discuss. One of the things that has also been, and part of where this whole notion of entourage effect came, and why you haven't seen the greater proliferation of some of the pharmaceutical extracts, is that as a properly used sort of medication, if you will, that the whole plant extracts have a better effect on the body than do singling out THC, or CBD. That it's better. It's sort of like natural vitamin C from orange juice than the synthetics that are out there. It's just better processed by the body. So moving on, come on. There we go. Entourage effect I just described, and that science of cannabis use. So the average THC has been increasing over the last 30 years, as I mentioned. And part of it has to do with back then, most of the production was taking place in Mexico and other parts of South and Central America. And so what's happening, most of the production today is taking place inside our borders, not outside our borders. And that means that the product is fresher. It hasn't been sitting for months and wherever. There's also more dedicated focus on breeding and growing, and sort of the technical expertise is much better than it was. And as a result of that, then the potency has increased. The other thing is that most people these days use and consume the flowers of cannabis, and they don't use the branches and the twigs and the leaves that used to be part of everything, because the flowers have the greatest potency, whereas the leaves and such have much less potency. So in answer to what had been said, asked earlier, the average cannabis potency that you might find in terms of recreational users is about 18% THC. And that's, significantly different from what it was now. And just by way of dosage, because dosage has been an important topic of some discussions, that, that the average joint, if you will, or the average whatever, has about 1/4 of a gram of cannabis in it, and that given what people actually consume and what's lost in terms of sharing with friends or going up and smoke or whatever it is an estimate that about the average dose in terms of someone's recreational use is about 10 milligrams that gets into the body. And so that's I think a useful thing to know, particularly if people are asking questions regarding well, aren't the edibles safer and that sort of stuff. It's just useful information to have. So methods of use, that there are 4 principal methods of use. Smoking still remains that which is most popular. More than 90% of people who describe using for whatever the purposes describe smoking. The use of edibles is about 15%. You see a much higher percentage of edible use, particularly with medicinal use, and that where people will use salves and tinctures and oils, and there are some transdermal patches out there for pain patients, but edibles is right there. Vaping, about 20%, that was a question from earlier on, described vaping, and it's also viewed as way more efficient than smoking a joint. And the vaping concentrate can be up to 70%, so it can be really potent. Most people, as the studies have sort of indicated, most people, when they're going to use, they smoke, in part because it's also the cheapest way. Dabbing is something where there's some pretty significant concern because what it is that you take there's a really hot surface. Oftentimes it's something like a titanium nail or a piece of ceramic or something like that, and then a highly concentrated form of a cannabis is dropped on the nail, sort of vaporizing it immediately, and then people inhale that. and that there is a fair amount of concern about dabbing. There are some of the more, what I view as more sort of up to where they should be, medicinal facilities have stopped selling the substances that that people use for dabbing. So I think that's a reasonable and good step, at least in that direction. Before we jump into risk and protective factors, one of the things that I think it's important to think about and to be aware of, and again, I think from a preventative perspective, if we're going to prevent or we're going to change human behavior, yeah, we need to understand the risk and protective factors, but we also need to be grounded in why are people doing these things. And so, you know, Lee and some other researchers in 2007 did a series of surveys. A couple of others have done something similar, and that they surveyed youth about, okay, why are you smoking marijuana? Why are you using marijuana? And about 2/3 said because they like it. They enjoy the experience of it. So that's what had been perceived as earlier kinds of things that, you know, the novelty, the experimentation, that it was kind of edgy and risky, was still pretty significant, about 40%. That about 40% of kids said that you know, they found, you know, that you know, their pals were all doing it, so that sense about social conformity. I went a little bit at the term of peer pressure, because I think it's sort of externalizing responsibility. And speaking as both a parent and a psychologist, I have concerns about that people are wanting to fit in, and that conformity, I think, is a thing, and that they feel like, particularly if you're a little bit anxious, as many teenagers are, they feel like it enhances the social experience. Boredom, relaxation are figuring there. Coping is an interesting one, because if somebody is saying I'm using it to cope, I mean, that is concerning. That, you know, about 1 in 7 are saying I use it to cope. So that might speak to some of that sort of mental health comorbidity, or that mental health concern that was referenced in the earlier question. And that a smallest percent saying, I like it because of it alters my perceptions, whether I'm thinking about things different or seeing things different or whatever. But I think it's important to understand, and from our part I would encourage without judgment, what are the motivators for use? Because if we're going to change behavior, we need to understand what's driving it in the first place. So, so that those are the top reasons that kids use. Come on, there we go. Other thing that we did, which I think was interesting, this is a bit older of an audience. These are people that are primarily between like 18 and 35. And we culled a series of things from the social media site Reddit, and the question was, well, why do you smoke marijuana, or why do you use marijuana? And these were a couple of the ones that seemed fairly common, like I do it to relax, just like somebody would have a beer. I use it to meditate. It inspires my creativity, and that it also then spoke to that this, some people are using it for more mental health symptom management. Whether that's the most effective way or not is probably a conversation for another day, but there are some people who clearly say, I use it for more behavioral health kind of purposes. Ask a bit more, there are people who say it works well for my medical issues, it works well for my anxiety and depression, I just like the way it makes me feel, it helps me to look in myself, and that there is a growing number of folks who are saying, it's helped me getting off of painkillers. I think may have seen some of the research about states that have, operational medicinal programs. They're prescribing of opioids, which is a great concern around the country, as you all know, is about 25% less than it was in like sort of comparative study. So it's an interesting phenomenon there. So so next what I want to do here is I want to just talk briefly about where there is reasonable science regarding medicinal cannabis. And and again, I'm not being a cheerleader here for anything, but I think it's important for us to know where the science is right now. The source that I would encourage any and all of you to take a look at is the National Academy of Science last year, or actually I guess it was in 2016, toward the end of that year, published an entire tome on the state of the science for medicinal cannabis. And yeah, it's a federal pub. It's not a it's not put out by Weed World or somebody like that. And that I think it gives a fair and balanced look, and a little bit skeptical, and that's good, regarding where's the sort of the state of the evidence right now. And that what they came up with principally were its best use was in mitigating pain, improving sleep, reducing the side effects, particularly related to certain medications and medications connected to cancer treatment. That's one of the places where it has been known that for refractory depression, not depression, but for refractory epilepsy, particularly certain types of childhood epilepsy, when all other medications have failed, it hasn't been a magic bullet, but the pure cannabidiol extracts have been helpful in terms of reducing, but not eliminating, but reducing the frequency of seizures in children. And that's where, yeah, I think you may well have seen the PBS did a piece on it. I think Sanjay Gupta did a piece. It's been on television, so that their evidence is there. As I mentioned before, medicinal use goes back 5,000 years. It was a mainstay in Chinese medicine, Hebrew medicine, Greek medicine. It was used throughout Europe in the 1500s, brought to the U.S. In the 1850s, it was registered in the U.S. pharmacopoeia, again, mostly for pain, and that it was used actually to support patients in terms of opium withdrawal during the opioid epidemic of the late 19th century here in the United States. And it first got its official medical recognition in the U.S. in 1976, after all of those changes that took place. An interesting thing to be aware of is that much of the work in terms of rigorous scientific research in medical cannabis has taken place outside the United States. The person who is described sort of as the godfather of medical cannabis is Dr. Meshlem from Hebrew University, and he was the first scientist who really brought rigorous scientific method. Interesting thing about Israel, they still have fairly restrictive laws on the books regarding recreational use, but they have really led the world in terms of looking at its medicinal properties. And interestingly, the U.S. has been one of his principal funders of his research since the 1950s. That's nearly 70 years. And part of that has been because there have been just really difficult barriers and prohibitions placed on medical cannabis research in the U.S. and that some of the best research that's going on has taken place outside the country because there aren't these same prohibitions that scholars have to put up with. When I was at the Harvard Symposium, one of the scholars, oh gosh, I forget where they're from, California, I think it was, had received an NIH grant to study. It took nearly 10 years to get through the hoops before they could initiate their study. And that was all just navigating all of the federal regulations. So it creates lots and lots of barriers. So a lot of people are doing their studies in Canada and Europe and Australia, and obviously they're in Israel, where they're allowing more rigorous study. If we look at what we've got there, to do a quick summary on medicinal use, there have to date been 140 randomized clinical trials, which is sort of the gold standard of research, and this is right out of National Academy of Science, and that these are the places where THC and cannabidiol have been found to be of great value, or of value that's been demonstrated by research. And they're laid out there, so I'm not going to bore you with walking through all 8 or 9 of them. But, pain sort of crosses over, and we see how cannabidiol certainly targets certain kinds of things, and that I would put there then the asterisk, again, speaks to helping to mediate some of the side effects. There is some research going on about does it have some protective value? Well, that information is not available. So this is straight out of National Academy of Science, and if you're really interested in understanding more about the science, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's only about 11,000 pages, so you can probably finish it in a night. Actually, I think it's about a 400-page document, but it's very well done. As we know, there are lots of research needs. This comes from NIDA in terms of their focus right now. I will editorialize a little bit, and nothing against NIDA. I know many of the folks there, but their focus is on drug abuse and drug abuse prevention, drug abuse intervention, drug abuse treatment. And their research portfolio focuses on that. So these are the things that are sort of on their radar right now. Truthfully, one of the things I like that they do, for preventionists, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there is something that periodically NIAAA does called the NESARC study, N-E-S-A-R-C. You can download a copy of it. And it is this broad study that is periodically done about alcohol and alcohol use in America. And that it is out of an NESARC study where safe, low-risk drinking guidelines were extracted from, and a lot of the public health information related to alcohol and alcohol consumption. My personal wish is that NIDA should do something similar in cannabis, because such a large percentage of the population with some frequency use marijuana. But I may be preaching to the choir here, or if anybody from NIDA is listening in, I think that would be a brilliant study to do. Okay, so in summary, I'm pretty close to it. Cannabis is the most widely used illicit substance in the United States. That's probably not a surprise to anybody. Most people, approximately 90% of those who consume cannabis do so by smoking, but increasing numbers of people are using alternative methods. I witness my home. I have a house here in Bethesda, Maryland, and I also have a place up in Rhode Island, right at the doorsteps of the University of Rhode Island. And I've known college students when I still had a practice up there who'd never smoked in their lives because they wanted to protect their lungs, but they did edibles and they did other things. So increasingly those alternative methods are getting more of a place. People are motivated to use cannabis for a whole host of reasons. Studies on medicinal cannabis are limited, but evidence suggests some utility for some medical conditions. And I would say that, that's where I think we need to be honest on both sides and critical thinkers on both sides. There are some magic bullet things that get put out, and that's just not true. There are no magic bullets. It may have some value for some people in some circumstances, and that's good. That's okay. So there are some correlations between cannabis use and psychiatric disorders, but they're not real well understood yet. They've been identified, but they really require further kinds of study. So with that, then, why don't we take 5 minutes or so, and I'd like to take some more questions for folks.
Joe, would you like to go ahead and take a few of the questions before the break?
Yes, please. Yeah, while
okay,
it's still
great.
Sort of on people's minds.
Great, and we'll go ahead and jump into some of them, and we may want to save a few of these that are more general toward the end, but let's go ahead and get started. And a couple of these are very medical in nature, so just be advised. So we've got one that says, I have a client with vasovagal syncope,
Yep.
and states that medical marijuana helps this. Is there any support for that?
Again, I'm happy to have a conversation with you offline about this at some point. Be more than happy to do that. There is anecdotal evidence that that particularly some of the, not the smoking stuff, but the oils, particularly high CBD rich oils, have had value for patients with like Crohn's disease and some of those other sort of, I'm assuming what you're referring to is so that vasovagal response that some folks get, and that there is some evidence. I don't know about the hard research on that, but there is some. I'm happy to take a look at it for you later on.
And we do have a second question that's fairly medical. I'll go ahead and pitch that way. Pitch that to you too. Does cannabis affect the organ system and or create a risk to the reproductive organ system in people?
Again, I would have to look at that. There was some early research. I don't know how accurate it is, to be quite honest. But this goes back over a decade ago, that for males who smoked lots of cannabis or used lots of cannabis, their sperm count went down, and so did their testosterone levels. But again, I don't know about the legitimacy of that research from back then, but there was a piece that was out a while ago. I think in terms of pregnancy, I don't think people should be using much of anything. So I certainly don't think it is good for either the mother or the fetus to be using. But I think that really is a conversation that a pregnant or expecting or mother should really have with her medical provider.
Thank you, Joe. The next question, what is the method that is frequently prescribed by practitioners?
First off, doctors generally, they don't officially prescribe. Doctors make a recommendation. That's how the sort of the laws in most states are, and they endorse a certification for medical cannabis, and that it varies pretty significantly from what I know from the medicinal providers on the West Coast and from some in Vermont as well as in and around here, Rhode Island and Rhode Island. that the industry is moving away from smoking because it's just not good for your lungs. It may not cause cancer, but it's not good for your lungs. And that they are moving towards systems of more careful dose measurement and the use of tinctures and oils and transdermal patches and those kind of things that are more in keeping with being able to more carefully control what's going on. And that's kind of where the industry is moving. But you know, I don't know if there are industry standards at this point in time, because again, the science is still playing catch up, and it probably will for at least another 5 to 10 years.
Okay, Joe, and the next question related to slide 15, and it says, can you describe the differences between dabbing and vaping? They sound similar in route of administration.
They are somewhat similar. The vaping, there is much more dosage control. There are actually some prototypes that I've seen in California that look very similar to albuterol. I don't have any connection with that pharmaceutical industry, but you know, an albuterol inhaler, like an asthma inhaler, where then a single dose is like 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams. So that I think with vaping you have better dosage control. Whereas dabbing, you know, you oftentimes, the patient or the user rather, is oftentimes, you know, ingesting, they're basically sort of freebasing a fairly high large amount of THC. So it really has to do with control. And there's not high heat connected to vaping. It is warmed and atomized, but it's not at it's not, you know, heated up to 400 degrees by a blowtorch.
All right, Joe, I'll ask one last question, then we'll go ahead and get ready for our break. I saw a reference in one of your, references for today's presentation. Are you going to be addressing later sort of the trends that you're seeing from across the different states?
Trends in consumption or levels of use?
Perhaps both, any and all.
I can speak to trends in consumption. I actually, I was able to avail a favor from a person who I sort of know. There is actually a data analytics company in Colorado that studies trends, and he sent me the 2018 trends for the country, or 2017 trends for the country, which I found just fascinating. And that in terms of consumption patterns, I can summarize what is known, and that, but yeah, I can certainly touch on that.
Okay, that would be great. And let's go ahead and take our break. We're about 15 minutes from where we should have taken our break. So we're going to do that now for 5 minutes. We will come back, let's say we're going to start sharp at 11:20. Thank you.
Sounds perfect. Okay.
And Joe, I'm going to go ahead and mute my phone for the next 5 minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Joe, are you ready to resume?
Yep, I'm just, now I am. Yep, I was answering a couple of emails in the quiet. Yes.
Okay,
I'm ready to resume.
I think we're ready if you are.
I'm ready. Moving on from the general discussion, the medicinal discussion, I want to start talking about the impacts of cannabis use, particularly some of what can be more, if you view more of the negative impacts. And here's a place where I think we all, again, need to practice some degree of restraint. That there are enough things about cannabis use to be concerned about that in terms of population health, that we don't need to overstate the facts. I was at a recent meeting in Atlanta that some of you may have actually been at regarding the opioid crisis. There are 2,000 people there. There were some folks that were near evangelical in terms of being anti-cannabis, and they were saying some things that just weren't true about, and that what happened as a result of that is that their message was lost on the audience. That people basically sort of viewed them as not credible. So I think that I would encourage both our clinicians and in particular our prevention folk to know that you're standing on reasonable ground. So first off, in terms of cannabis use disorder, actually the National Household Survey is slightly lower than this, but from our studies, approximately 20% of people, of adults, who use cannabis have some degree of a use disorder. We have a slide a little bit later on that stratifies risk from some work that we had done, but it's approximately 20%. That doesn't necessarily mean all 20% need to go into specialty care, that there is some strong evidence that some early intervention folk, particularly those folks in the milder range, that they can activate some healthful behaviors and change. Now, cannabis use disorder, about 20% of the population. In terms, there are some known neurocognitive effects that are not so good. I will jump down below to where it's, the short-term effects on neurocognitive performance, and what we do know, not from just like I smoked once a month ago, but more so from those particularly youth who are engaged in more regular use, that learning and memory is impacted, processing speed of information is impacted, executive functioning in terms of attention, planning, and problem solving can be impacted. What is true, and this is the new information that was just published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, is that abstinence appears to return users to what was their normal, with their baseline level of cognitive functioning, which is a good thing. It's not permanent brain damage, as there had been some alarms that we're worrying about. And so that's the neurocognitive piece translates into important messaging. So I would encourage particularly our prevention folks to be mindful of that, because that translates into how well are you going to do in school, and kids who are regular smokers don't do as well in school. How well are you able to communicate with each other? Are you learning some of the kinds of things you need to? So there are important ways that diminishing cognitive functioning over a sustained period of time, has kinds of negative impacts in terms of what translates into the real world for young people. So that's one. Risky behaviors, there are a couple to be mindful of. It's not necessarily at the same level of risk that you see with alcohol, for instance, but we do see some risky sexual behavior, unprotected sexual behaviors, driving motor vehicles. Those are the kinds of things that are probably most concerning related to cannabis intoxication, and that they will do things that are just can be that are either life-threatening or otherwise concerning in terms of behavioral health or health risks and safety risks. Biphasic reaction, I already mentioned that for some folks, and again, the responses are highly individualized. Biphasic effect, actually I know several folks who just won't use cannabis at all because it doesn't matter how much they use or even relatively small amounts, it has the almost immediate biphasic effect. So some folks, that it will just give them the opposite of what they were looking for. So that those are some of the known negative behavioral effects, and that, as I alluded to, all of these things can adversely impact school, work, social performance, and I think a thing to be mindful of, particularly for youth and youth transitioning into adults, it can have some negative impact in terms of life trajectories. What I did not include in here was as involvement with the justice system. I did that in part, truthfully, because I don't want to get on my personal soapbox around criminalizing young people for substance use behavior. And I think that there's enough going on right now in the country looking at that behavior. So, but particularly here, anecdotally we know, people who are high all throughout high school are not as socially skillful or socially competent when they are young adults. Like, how do I talk to a girl? How do I talk to a boy? How do I talk to an employer? How do I have a difficult conversation with a close friend? I mean, there are some impacts that it can have. Not that people can't learn those things, but that those things are generally things that we sort out between the ages of 12 and 21, how to be more socially skillful. So that I think those are sort of known behavioral impacts. Impact of use on physical health, it's not great for your lungs to smoke. There was a lot of worry about cancer. That has not been shown to be. That was part of how they started looking more carefully at CBD, cannabidiol. But it can cause some upper respiratory concerns. You can be more vulnerable to things, like bronchitis. There are some concerns about COPD. So smoking is just not a good thing. And that's where, again, I think in terms of the medicinal industry, they're trying to move people away from smoking. There are some folks that it will help sleep. There are other folks it will keep them up all night. So that and then even for some folks that get to sleep using cannabis, they will not get the kind of REM sleep that they need. Hyperemesis, you don't see it that often, but it does happen with some folks. It's actually relatively easy to fix, but it is just basically uncontrollable spasms of vomiting that can happen related to cannabis. And then the biphasic effect that I already mentioned, that results in an ED admission. And one of the things I think to be mindful about in terms of cannabis is that you would have to consume something about approaching 1,000 pounds of it to make it life-threatening. In terms of, overdosing or dying. But that said, there's still some health concerns to be mindful of. That it doesn't have that same mortality risk as do opioids or benzos or alcohol, but it still has other health risks to be mindful of, and that and that, that those are important. Relationship to mental health symptoms. One of the things where you do hear some evidence related to this is that related to severe mental illness, the evidence suggests that that the use particularly of high-potency THC may bring about early onset psychotic symptoms with somebody who may be predisposed in the first place. The evidence that it causes it, truthfully, is all over the map. But I think where there is some consensus is that it can precipitate some psychotic symptoms. I think that the research that was done by Ketty and all regarding the some of the hereditary predispositions and genetic factors still is probably the best evidence that are out there. But there can be precipitating events, and that might be smoking cannabis that prompts the first psychotic break. Anxiety and panic systems. There is not a lot of evidence that it actually causes anxiety disorders, but in higher doses it can certainly exacerbate anxiety disorders. So let's talk about what motivates people to change. And we're going to talk some more about that a bit later on as well. But when we're thinking about folks, we talked about earlier why youth and, adults, but why youth might choose to use because they like it and any number of reasons. But it's also then important to look at what might motivate change. And that there have been several studies actually done on that. And I think one of the more interesting ones that we looked at was what people prioritized in terms of motivators. And peer and family disapproval ranked up there as one of the top ones. There's one that's not on here that should be, and I'll talk a bit about that later, in that's financial. I mean, as we know with tobacco and tobacco intervention, how much money you have in your pocket and how expensive is something has a lot to do with whether you smoke or not. But peer disapproval, family disapproval are important motivators because inherently we are social creatures and we want to belong. Lack of motivation speaks to, I'm not being the kind of person I want to be. I'm just blobbing on the couch and I'm playing video games all day. The other part is that I'm just, it feels like I'm brain dead. I don't know how to talk to girls. I don't know how to talk to boys. I don't know how to talk. My social skills are being adversely affected. It can intensify mood, sometimes not in a good way. I'm not feeling good about myself and what I'm doing with my life, and work and school performance. Those tend to be the principal motivators for behavioral change and sort of activating change behavior. One of the things that was kind of interesting is that, and it leads to a slide a little bit later on, is that the things that were least motivating for change is it's going to harm your health and you might get arrested. And that oftentimes with parents and others, that is the default go-to. You're going to get in trouble, or or it's going to kill you, or something along those lines. And those are not the things that motivate kids, and they don't motivate adults either when we really look at it. These are the kinds of things, because these are the things that have more personal meaning for people. So in terms of messaging, that's an important thing to keep in mind. Risk and protective factors. There are many factors, and one of the things to be mindful of in terms of risk and protective factors is that it really speaks to a series of items that can help to set the stage for a substance use disorder. It doesn't necessarily contribute to whether somebody initiates use or not, except in certain circumstances, or not all of them do. So I think that it's important to understand that. And risk and protective factors can be biological, they can be psychological, family, community, cultural characteristics, and that they're more associated with higher likelihood of something happening. And importantly, or as importantly, protective factors are characteristics that are associated with lower likelihood of problems to occur. This is, original work was done by Hawkins and Catalano out of the University of Washington, and that they basically adapted some earlier work done on cardiovascular disease to behavioral health. But again, it is important to recognize that this is not about predicting initiation of use, it's about does experimentation lead to a substance use disorder. So it's important to understand risk and protective. This is a very condensed slide that comes out of the Institute of Medicine about this. I'm going to blow this up. I'm going to, that's maybe not the right adjective to use. I'm going to further detail this in a few slides that, again, really targeting specifics for youth. A number of these, as you might notice, are now sort of have been not repurposed, but are also those things when you hear people talking about social determinants of health. That adverse childhood experiences are important sort of contributors to social determinants of health, living in poverty, living in crime. Have you witnessed crimes of violence? Have you witnessed somebody being murdered? All of these kinds of things are important determinants and certainly major risk factors. So I'm going to go into the weeds a little bit on risk and protective factors, because I think, again, for preventionists, more detailed understanding of risk and protective factors is useful for you in terms of targeting your behaviors and targeting some of the work you do. Impulsivity, high sensation-seeking behavior, problems with communication, poor interpersonal skills, those are important sort of risk and protective factors. Peer affiliations, again, school bonding, a sense of my life is just not going anywhere, sort of those are all significant youth risk factors. And those are things where you can build strategies, or there are some really good evidence-based programs that are already out there that you might want to take a new look at. I mean, one of my favorites, at least in terms of public schools, and I have no financial interest here, but I've known it for many, many years, is Project Success, that's developed by Eleanor Morehouse, and it's a really nice program. There's there are a lot of good programs out there that really are strength-based and youth-focused and really help to youth develop these more resiliency-focused kinds of skills. Other risk factors, self-esteem, prenatal exposure, kids in our child welfare systems where there has been some disruption or poor attachment are at very high risk. Difficult relationships with friends, families, school teachers, others, and that can be a significant risk factor. Certain biological risk factors are important to be aware of. You don't see as much of it with some of our kids, with younger people, but head injury is an important thing to be mindful of, particularly with transition-age adults who may then have some mild brain injury going on. So those are some other risk factors to be mindful of. I do want to say that our kids who are in the child welfare system, oftentimes related to familial substance abuse, are at very high risk. I know that there are a couple of places that are targeting child welfare involved families, particularly Norma Finkelstein's work out of Boston, the Institute of Health and Recovery. They're brilliant. They're just brilliant, wonderful people up there. And you know, a lot of places have looked to them for working with these folks. Intelligence can be a factor. Attention, particularly kids who may have sort of attentional issues. ADHD kids are exponentially higher risk in terms of developing a substance use problem. Sort of emotional maturity, scholastic performance, all of these kinds of things. And because all of these kinds of things connect to, in terms of making it real, that to social connectedness with sort of a more positively focused youth and community culture, that these things can really interfere with that. And I think from a strength perspective, you know, the more we can do to build the positive attachments for these young folks, whether it's prevention work or if we're providing treatment services, I think it's important to be mindful of those kind of things. One of the things that's interesting, and that there is some, truthfully, some wrong information out there regarding cannabis use and adolescence, is that cannabis use in adolescence spans all socioeconomic strata. There were some earlier things written, and I think, truthfully, I hope a little bit of embarrassment on their part, because it still gets circulated around, that would invite the reader to believe that this is a problem of poor people. And it's not. I mean, yes, poor kids will use cannabis, and middle-class kids will use cannabis, and rich kids will use cannabis. So it really spans all SES. I learned that sort of front-handed. I was still working in the clinic at the time. I have a youngest daughter who was very bright, got a full scholarship to a private school in Rhode Island. Great school. And she was academically quite talented. And what I learned there was the rich kids partied just as much as the kids at the high school where she came from. They just had access to doing it in hotels with daddy's credit card. So that, you know, it really is not just a poor person's phenomenon. Family risks, histories of mental illness, incarceration, abuse, neglect, familial substance use and abuse, lack of parental support, you know, it's sort of, I think probably one of the bigger things to be mindful of, and there's some really interesting prevention programs. I think actually Florida was one of the champions of them. Florida and Georgia had to do with parental separation and divorce and the stress that that causes on families and some preventative focus that can take place in terms of both the children and the families, because kids who are going through particularly a divorce that is not well resolved are at elevated risk for all kinds of substance use. And what I was involved with setting up that prevention program in Massachusetts years ago, and we looked to Florida and to Georgia for some of the early work that they had done in that area. And there's some neat things that have been done through your family courts. And then sort of the physical or mental illness of a loved one. Those are all familial risk factors. Now let's talk about protective factors. That, you know, family support obviously is a major thing. You know, feeling safe and supported within one's neighborhood, feeling safe in general, having in one's life positive role models, feeling valued, you know, a family that has standards and sort of expectations of conduct. I hope the ones that are reasonable. You know, valuing participation in school, having positive relationships, having some internal drivers about wanting to do well. An interesting one, that kids who read for pleasure tend to be, that's an important protective factor. Having a set of basic coping skills are really important. Communication skills are a protective factor. Standing up for what one believes is right. and that the resisting peer pressure, I would say that I would probably reframe it a little bit differently, that having adequate communication skills to reason, to kind of protect what one believes to be right and to be able to communicate and negotiate that. So the things like life skills training and assertiveness training, all those kind of preventative kinds of programs are really useful so that people have sort of the social tools to manage optimism and feeling like our life has a purpose. Those are important protective factors for our young folk. I'm going to move on because it looks like I've been talking quite a bit. Adolescents with substance use are largely undiagnosed, and they contribute across socioeconomic, they're distributed across socioeconomic status. They do have a high comorbidity of psychiatric problems. There are concerns regarding cannabis DUI risk. Hyde is doing some work. Colorado right now is doing a lot of studying on this. They don't exactly have findings yet about what that means. They know that there are risks there. And that youth prevalence rates in the U.S., somebody was asking about that, about 38% of all high school seniors have used marijuana in the past month, and that about 90% of kids say it's fairly easy to get. It's actually easier to get than alcohol. And that we know that it's easier to obtain, it's cheaper to buy, and it's stronger in potency. Prevalence rates in Florida, that there's newly available data. We can make that available to you from monitoring the future. If you have local data in Florida, that's useful. Truthfully, I would, any data that's more than a couple of years old, that I would take with a grain of salt because things change. And perception of harm is lower than people are, that are lower than people would like to see it. And I think our last thing here is that, cannabis has known risks, but the risks are primarily in social, emotional, learning, and risky behavior while under the influence. So I'm going to move through this, and let's catch this at the end because there's some content that I want to get to quickly for folks before our time runs out. Okay. So preventing. One of the important questions that we asked ourselves is that are we asking the right questions? Are we using the best approach to change behavior? And that part of our answer was no, we're not. And that's what sort of prompted this work about 3 or 4 years ago. One of the things that I want to introduce to you is a tool that we've created and validated, and that it's called the Cannabis Intervention Screener. And for the prevention folks on the line, you may never use this tool, but what I would encourage you to be aware of is that the elements that are in there are important things to pay attention to, because these are elements that are different from traditional screening tools and that they're very cannabis specific. And our conclusion was we have been asking some of the wrong questions. So this was developed by Center for Behavioral Health Integration with some help from my parent organization, and that up in Vermont, then it was validated in 3 states with 600 different, actually a little bit more than 600 individuals from around the country. Findings were important that if you ask more cannabis-specific questions, you get better results than other substance use screening tools like the DAS, the Drug Abuse Screening Test, and that one of the things that we learned is that if people are using weekly or more, that is probably the best indicator of risky behavior. If somebody says, yeah, I smoked 3 months ago, that's, that may not be as much of a concern. If somebody's saying, I am using multiple times a week, multiple times a day, that is probably the person where you want to do the problem identification and referral. There are some other important places where we take a look at it. I'm going to quickly walk you through what are the elements of the tool. Frequency of use is probably the single biggest indicator of concern. Like I said, if somebody used once a month or 2 months or 3 months ago, you can do more of a preventative messaging. Might even say, oh, well, you know, why haven't you used more frequently? And they might say, I just didn't like the way it feels, and then you can reinforce that. But frequency is an important thing to look at. Reasons for use are an important thing to look at. And then looking at what are the negative impacts. And for your perspective, understanding what are the negative impacts, because that can help you target strategies and target messages. So when we screen folks, and we are screening in high schools and in college health services and family practices and primary care practices in multiple states at this point. How often do you use cannabis of any sort? People who are saying weekly or more are your targeted higher risk population. People who say that I'm using several times a month or less, the evidence has been that these folks are not or have not really experienced anything measurable in terms of negative consequences. And I mention that because if people haven't experienced negative consequences, their motivation to change is different than somebody who has. And that's my only reason. I'm not saying that there aren't other concerns, but that's where the evidence leads. When you use, how often do you use? How do you ways of using? That's more useful in terms of some other things. This is a second part that's important to understand. You know, do you use for enjoyment? Yes or no? That tells you one thing. Are you using, and then thinking of a younger audience, are you using for other kinds of reasons, like I'm worried, I'm stressed, I'm unhappy, whatever it might be. So if people are using for more affective reasons and sort of behavioral health reasons, that's concerning, again, where you might want to consider sort of digging a bit deeper. That particular group there who are talking for those purposes are the group that, from what we saw, were at highest risk for developing a cannabis use disorder. So just for your edification there. Now I'm going to talk through quickly what were the 10 questions that we found to have the greatest potency. One is, have you tried to control your use? If the person says yes, that's a significant indicator, because that speaks to the fact, they're concerned about something. The second is, and this has been an interesting, important motivator, is, are you spending too much money? Have you used when you've gone to school? Have your friends or family voiced concern? Have you ever driven a car, been in a car, motor vehicle? All of those kinds of things are important concerns. And then have you smoked when you promised yourself not to? All of these things are important elements to be mindful of when you're having those kind of prevention education conversations. Again, jumping into health and focusing on health and legality, you're not going to get as potent of a conversation as when you focus on these things that are part of a person's life, and these are more tuned into who the person views themselves as being, how the person sort of, where their values might lie, and you'll get a richer conversation. You'll be able to provide richer education when you focus on those dimensions versus immediately jumping into it's going to mess up your lungs. Not to say you might not mention that, but that doesn't have the same level of impact as this kind of a focus does. From the sampling of 600, and that was people from 16 to 65, that was the stratification that we saw in terms of cannabis use, and that there was about, and this nearly mirrors some of the National Household Survey information, so which gave it some credibility. And it also nearly mirrors the risk stratification that we've seen done related to alcohol use. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and we had this done independently to avoid any bias. We engaged an independent psychometrician to do the work. So in quick summary, to go there, I know we're getting close on time. One of the things that I would encourage folks to be mindful of, and this might be a conversation for another day if you want to, is that I think really learning some of the core skills of motivational interviewing and mobilizing those into the work that you do is a really important set of skills for preventionists as well as clinicians, because it is a way to engage people better, and that it really helps to move something from what is viewed as external information and feedback that you may be providing to help them then to make it more of an evocative conversation where they begin to think more about what does this mean for me. And that later on in here we have some session scripts where we have sort of showed how some of these conversations can occur. So the slide deck will be there for you. I think I'm going to pause here because, you know, as you may know, I'm quite interested in the topic. I could probably talk for another hour, but I recognize that people have made certain commitments. So with that, maybe we can take a few last questions. How does that sound?
Joe, that's just about perfect. We have got lots of questions, but I was thinking the same thing. We'll tackle 3. So let's go and address the tool that you just ran through, the interview tool. I had a question whether or not that can be accessed from a website.
At the back of the slide deck, there is an email address to Dr. Turner, and if you send him an email, he'll make the tool available to you. There is a training that's connected to that, but that's a conversation for another point. The other thing I would ask of you is that the questions that don't get asked, if you want to send them to me, I will, or if you want to sort of, cull them a little bit, or curate them a little bit, but I'll provide answers to those, and you can post those on your website.
Thank you. That would be perfect. All right. So the next question would be, could you speak to the relationship between marijuana and the opioid crisis? The statistics are medical cannabis states have lower opioid overdoses. So that statistic is hard evidence. There are some folks who would put out gateway theories. Gateway theory is, I wouldn't call it nonsense, but it doesn't bear up to strong scrutiny. I think adverse childhood experiences are more of the gateway to problematic behavioral health than that. And if you really want to look at a gateway drug, it's probably nicotine. So that's a long question. There is some hard study going on both inside and outside this country, particularly looking at cannabidiol-rich compounds and creations for use for opioid withdrawal, but also in the treatment of chronic pain, which is about 40 to 50% of the opioid-dependent population. All right.
I can pick up another one if you'd like.
Yes, please. In fact, you touched on the last question we have time to address, and that does relate to nicotine. We have a question that if you're familiar with any specific treatment aspects of mixing tobacco and cannabis, something called a blunt where the nicotine, the tobacco is mixed
Sure.
in the use of the cannabis and whether or not there are different therapies that come into play related to that.
Well, I mean, it is unhelpful, or it is to do anything with tobacco because of its known carcinogenic properties. There is some mixed opinion about the cannabis neutralizing some of those carcinogenic properties, but I mean, it certainly is much more caustic to the lungs.
And have you seen anything or heard of anything related to sort of different therapies related to that treatment?
I have not. I'm happy to take a look.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. So we have just reached 12 o'clock, and Joe, I need to sort of take control back of the presentation now if you are ready.
I'm fine.
All right. Well, this has been very engaging, and we so much appreciate you taking time and sharing your expertise with the group. Certainly we have had lots and lots of great questions, so there clearly is a lot of interest in this area.
Yeah,
so I'm going to go ahead and take control back now.
Okay.
All right, great. I'd like to remind everyone, I did mention this at the beginning of the presentation today, but when I conclude the webinar, your browser is going to take you to an evaluation on FADA's website. And of course, if you want to receive continuing education credits or a statement of credit for this event, do complete the evaluation for us. When you follow the link to complete the evaluation, you're going to be prompted to register or sign in to the online community in order to complete it. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE Broker, for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, please do provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time that you register with the online community. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You may consider using the same email address when you register for the webinars through our WebEx link and when you set up your profile in FADA's system for the first time. This just helps connect your attendance and your profile. You're going to get a second opportunity today to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today. So if you don't have time to do the evaluation right now, that's okay. In about 30 minutes, you're going to get an email, and the sender is going to be messenger@WebEx. Do be aware, the evaluation will close at midnight on Friday, June 22. After we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. You will be notified when a statement of credit has been generated on your behalf. And then finally, let me just say thank you to everyone who participated in the webinar today and for everyone who sent questions to us. They were great. We'd also like to recognize and thank especially the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. So again, Joe, thank you. Thanks to everyone else on the webinar, and have a great rest of your day. And hold now, please, for the evaluation. Thanks all.
Thank you.